If we were to understand the Australian legal system, it's important for us to understand what we mean by federalism and what the source of law refers to. So the purpose of this video will be to explain the concept of federalism. We'll start by looking at the separation of power and what it means and how it's implemented in Australia, and then we'll move on towards the end to talk about the common law jurisdiction that's adopted in Australia. So moving on to the separation of powers. Basically, how the nation runs, Australia as a nation, how it runs, is based on the three separate powers that you see in front of you. Now, I'll start off by talking about Parliament. So Parliament basically has the power to make and change the law. Um, it's also referred to as the legislator. It is made of two houses, so the House of Representatives and the Senate. Moving on to the judiciary part of this diagram. So the judiciary is basically, you can think of it as the judges and courts that make up the legal system in Australia. They have the power to make judgments on the law that's passed by the Parliament. Now, in Australia, we've got the High Court of Australia. That's the highest court. So that's at the top of the judicial hierarchy. And then we have federal courts and also state courts. So all these courts form part of the judiciary system in Australia. Now, the third part of the diagram is the executive government. So, and they've got the power to put law into action. Now, the executive government in Australia you can think of it as basically the Queen, and it's represented by the Governor General. In in the Australian Convention, it's also implied that in the Australian Constitution, sorry, it's also implied via convention that the Prime Minister and ministers in the government, they are part of that executive government. Basically, what you have to realize is that each of these separate branches of the government, they have separate powers. So Parliament passes the laws, the judiciary system implements or makes judgments on the law, and then the executives are the ones that implement that law. Moving on to the concept of federalism. Now, federalism is important in the Australian concept because Australia is referred to as a federal state. It's composed of the Commonwealth government, and then you have the six separate states. And the federation basically refers to the union of these six colonies that existed into one nation. So that's the whole concept of federalism, and it ties very closely to the discussion on the separation of powers that I just went through. In terms of the structure of government, so you have the Australian Constitution that defines these three separate powers, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. As we talked about, the legislative power, that's represented by the House of Representatives and the Senate. The executive power, that's the Governor General, and then the judicial power, you've got the High Court and the judges in it, and plus the federal courts and the judges in it. And you also, as I mentioned, you also have the state courts as part of that judicial system. Now, the common law jurisdiction, and that's an important jurisdiction to talk about because that's the jurisdiction that's implemented in Australia. Basically, when we talk about the common law jurisdiction, there's two aspects to it. The first aspect is the statute, so that's the legislation that's passed by Parliament. Then we have common law itself, and I'll explain these in detail. So for a statute, it's basically the law that's made by the Parliament, and it can be the federal Parliament or it can be the state parliaments, okay, or the territory. So these parliaments, they pass certain laws, and usually how it starts is that you start off with a bill, and if the bill is approved by the two houses, so the House of Representatives and the Senate, they become acts. Now you can have acts that are passed by the Commonwealth, by the federal parliament, or you can have acts that are passed by the individual state parliaments. Now this last point is just for you to note that sometimes these various we have different descriptions to which mean the same thing basically. So an act is a statute, it's a legislation. So these are words that you can use interchangeably. Um, what you also need to note is that statutory law is the primary source of law in Australia. All cases, they start with interpreting the legislation that's made by the Commonwealth or the states, and hence it's an essential source of law in the Australian common law jurisdiction. Now, I'll give an example over here to differentiate between state law and Commonwealth law when it comes to statutory law. So in New South Wales, we've got an act. That act or that legislation usually applies to people that live in New South Wales only. So we're not concerned about people that live in Victoria. If it's a New South Wales Act, it applies to the people that live in New South Wales. And the courts and judges in New South Wales would be using that um, legislation. So they would be interpreting that legislation in New South Wales. On the other hand, if it's an act that's passed by the Commonwealth, then it applies to all of Australia, and the federal courts and the judges in these courts would be interpreting these acts. So it's not specific to a particular state. Now, if you guys remember when I said that there are two sources to a common law jurisdiction, I said there's the statute and then there's the common law. And so the common law is basically, you can think of it as law that's made by judges. It's based on precedents. So what we mean by that is based on, historical cases and how judges decided these cases. We extract decisions. So judges in present cases extract decisions based on these past cases or past decisions that have been made by previous judges. Um, it's a law that has been developed from judgments handed down in the court, and that's what I just explained. And it usually covers areas that are not covered by statute. So if an area is already covered by a statute, then there's no need for you to refer to the common law. However, you have to note that if you look at various industries and in specific construction, because that's what we are interested in, there's a lot of disputes that arise. And so it's impossible to have an act for each dispute that arises. Hence why, in areas that are not covered by the statute, we adopt the common law as the source of law. Now, the areas that are included in the common law, you've got negligence, issues related to torts, contract issues. So these are all issues that we'll be covering in the course. The second point over here, what you guys need to note is that when it comes to common law, we usually refer to cases. So we look at decisions made in cases, and the way we reference cases is through the notation system that you see in front of you. So party X would be the plaintiff, so the party that initiates the lawsuit against party Y. So party Y would be the defendant. And the V over here refers to the word and. So it's not versus, but it's and. So we've got party X and party Y. And you'll see that in the course where I'll be referring to cases in this format. So this is an important point to understand or to realize for now. So common law is a source of law, but what constitutes common law? There's a lot of areas, but the areas that we are interested in for the purposes of this course. First off, contract law. What is contract law? Contract law is part of the common law jurisdiction. It's law that is associated with the legal enforcement of promises made by parties. So two parties that have freely bargained and entered into a legal relationship. So any law that concerns, that enforcement of the promise is classified as contract law. And as I said, it's mostly common law jurisdiction. However, in recent times, we've seen a lot of acts that have been passed. So a lot of statute law that's been applied into contract law, and that's mostly related to consumer protection. So contracts that you form with, consumers when you sell them products. And, given the sheer amount of disputes that had arisen in the past, government decided to enact, legislation that specifically focuses on these aspects. So when we have areas within contract law that are governed by statute law, that's the law that we adopt. So it wouldn't be, president's law, so common law that is based on judgments of judges in the past. We just look at the statute, and then the judge would interpret that statute. The other area of common law is tort law. And that's another area that we will be focusing on in the course. It's part of the common law jurisdiction, as I said. It's concerned with civil wrongs that are done by one party to another. And when you look at, tort law cases, it's usually as a result of a breach of the duty imposed by the law. Whereas in contract law, the breach is usually, it's a breach of the imposed agreement. It's not the case in tort law, so we're not looking at the breach of the agreement, but we're looking at the imposed duty by the law that has been breached. And of course, that breach in tort law would give the parties involved, or the innocent party, the right to sue for unliquidated damages. So I'll be explaining that in more detail later on in the course. Finally, the last area that we will be looking at in the course is property law. And property law, again, part of the common law jurisdiction. It's a system of laws that regulate and prioritize property law rights. So these property law rights, it's important to understand that when I say property, I am referring to the relationship, a legal relationship with a thing. So there's a common misconception that people have when it comes to property, and they think that property refers to the real estate, a building, a house, etc. It's not the case. So it's just part of property law. Property is defined as a legal relationship with a thing, and so property law is concerned with the formation of rights or interests with that thing. So your property can be real, so real estate, for instance, your land, your buildings, or it can be personal. And personal can then have further two classifications. So you can have tangible personal properties, for instance, a car, versus intangible property such as shares that you might own. So it's important to understand that property is not referring just to buildings. It concerns other aspects, and the way to look at it is through understanding that it's a legal relationship with a thing. Okay, so this is a list of references that I've adopted. I'd highly recommend that you guys have a look at each individual reference. Thank you.